in the latest official draft. There have been some informal meetings since that have helped to try and reduce that. But irrespective, it means that in our actual COP itself, in a couple of weeks' time, there is going to be a lot of work. Now, some of those square brackets were relating to this question of nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based approaches. How do you recognize the role of nature, the joint crises of nature and climate change, of biodiversity and climate change within the framework? And I think the fact that UNFCCC, now at COP27, has taken a decision that has helped perhaps to bridge that gap from that side is a positive step. Now we just need to respond. I think the issue, the fundamental idea of recognizing that there is a role of nature in addressing climate change, but also that these two issues, biodiversity, climate change, and through the conventions are interlinked is definitely a positive step. I don't think it was especially controversial. It was more sort of political maneuvering than anything else. But as Elke mentioned in her keynote earlier, it's about implementation and the fact that we only have 8 years of this decade left, and we can't have a repeat of what happened last time with the Aichi targets, where it was a number of years before NBSAP were finally either developed or revised, and action was finally happening. As Bertha mentioned, in terms of the finance, there's a difference between pledges and actual financial flows. We need to see that happening both within UNFCCC and within CBD now, straight after COP27, but also straight after COP15. In terms of the mood in the office, yeah. I mean, I think people are positive, especially after some of those informal meetings that have been happening. But there have been, I'm not sure if I should really say this, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Say it.
Say it, yes.
Well, there have been a number of mentions that this could be the Copenhagen moment for CBD, which is a very negative outlook on this process. But there is a big uphill to overcome before we actually finally have the GBF adopted before Christmas. Of course, we want the GBF to be as ambitious and yet feasible as possible. And one of the issues with these negotiating processes is you have to have consensus, and so that can lead to the lowest common denominator, which can be frustrating. But as mentioned, it's as much about implementation as the actual words on a page when it comes to the 21st of December, that we actually do have something that parties and everyone, because it's not just governments, it's whole of government, but also whole of society, that everyone sees their role and starts working as soon as possible afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Tristan. And we all, it's great that you're there and pushing things. Just to say that here from the podium. Thanks a lot for your statement also. Elke, let me turn to you again. And you've now had the chance also to listen to your colleagues. So based on what you heard, what are you taking with you on the way, like to Montreal and to COP15? What are important outcomes for NBS that you're looking forward to? What is your reflection on that?
Yeah, thank you. I was listening very carefully to my 4 colleagues here on the panel, and I must say I agree with everything. All of you made important points, and I just want to tip on some of them. Actually, I also agree that that COP27 acknowledged the importance of addressing loss and damage is so great. It's really, it's an important sign. But to my point of view, there was no linkage in thinking about how does it relate to adaptation? Because I mean, it's a tragedy that we have to talk about loss and damages. Where is adaptation to in front, so to say. So this is something that I was really missing. Let's say it's an intellectual link, but it's also a very practical link. On financing, Bertha, you mentioned a lot of important aspects. Actually, we had this discussion within the German government. Is biodiversity financing the same as climate financing? How is it interrelated? And it's still ongoing, this discussion, but we came up to an agreement or a common understanding that 93% of our biodiversity financing is climate relevant. So of course it's interlinked, right? And this is also something that has to be thought together even more. And I think first step is maybe done, but it could and should be more integrated. And I'm lucky to be in the position to say that within the biodiversity focus area within the International Climate Initiative, which is in the hands of our unit, we work really in a balanced way. So saying that everything that we support, every single cent we spend is climate relevant, of course, and biodiversity relevant. And furthermore, we also have achieved a 50-50 balance. But I think it's something that you really have to fight for to come to this balance. One aspect in the UNFCCC COP27, which was important for us, and maybe some of you followed that up, is that we launched an initiative, an NBS initiative, together with IUCN and the Egyptian presidency. And you might say, what's the added value of such an initiative in
it's
terms
called
of
ENACT, right?
ENACT, right? What's the added value about that? I think the most important added value is that this initiative will be at any following COP from now on and report. This is really important, so that the topic of NBS will be a part of the following COPs. And of course, we expect more added value from this initiative, but this is also a very important aspect, I think. On the wording which we find on NBS and EBA in the final decision, in the cover decision from the COP27, I think the wording, of course it's good to have it there, but we have inserted the wording on a very high price. I think the how it is placed and in connection only with forests is a very poor result in terms of what NBS and EBA can deliver. But still, of course, it's important, and I think we can be, even if it's relatively limited wording, we can be a bit optimistic with regards to COP15, that it might be a first step to convince those parties who are struggling with the wording. Actually, I mentioned when I did my first remarks that we have several COPs running. There was also the Ramsar COP just recently running in Geneva. Ramsar is the Convention on Freshwater Systems, and even there it was possible to insert wording on NBS or EBA. We would have loved to see and EBA, but I think there's some movement. So I think there's room for optimism, although I also very much agree that anything can happen until Christmas. We will definitely continue we will definitely continue working with nature-based solutions anyhow. This is, I mean, it's a bit strange to say that regardless of the outcome of the CBD, we are committed to work with NBS continuously. And I think there's also a small light of hope, and this is my last point, also coming from business side. I think we also had planned to have.
I forgot to say that. Michael Roth of Munich Re was
yeah.
supposed to be here, but he caught a flu, and he's in bed, unfortunately. We're sending him greetings from here, but he couldn't join.
Yeah, but actually, I think this is also, there's growing interest in the business case of NBS, and this is so important. And I think all this together gives me some optimism.
That's good. We're looking for optimism also in our discussion here. Let me pick up this word that we heard a lot of times now: synergies, integration, and all what's about like mainstreaming, bringing things together. There's an interesting study that was put forward by WWF. It's called Our Climate Secret Ally, and it says basically nature is our ally for mitigation. Nature is our ally for adaptation and resilience. Obviously, nature cannot do everything when it comes to climate change, but evidence shows it can do a lot, and it has done a lot already in absorbing our emissions. But we're losing our ally. We're losing nature, so we have to protect nature. So it's kind of like a circle. There's all these interlinkages, and let me be a bit provocative also. Like if we know all these interlinkages and synergies, we still work in silos. So there's starting to be more synergies in the convention. Tristan, you stressed that in the beginning they were not supposed to be apart, but still there is separate conventions and there's different separate COPs. So I'm not suggesting to change that immediately, but just for a thought. Based on scientific evidence, there are obvious interlinkages, but there is the IPBES and there is the IPCC. And Lisa, you're part of the IPCC researchers and scientists. There are synergies in finance, but there are separate funds and funding streams. There are synergies between national and climate biodiversity action on the ground, but there's NDCs and NB subs. Okay, so let's think about along these lines in a very practical manner. What is the way forward in terms of bringing the things together with a focus on implementation? We heard about synergies between mitigation, adaptation. Obviously, adaptation is part of loss and damage in order to avoid or reduce loss and damage. Lisa, what do you think from your perspective, having heard all what has been said, and also this kind of like trying to say, okay, let's come together. How does it work from your perspective?
I mean, I think one thing that's interesting to me as somebody who focused mainly on the human aspects is that for me, the missing discussion, the missing kind of piece in not just in the UNFCCC, but in IPCC, to be honest, also, is that there's not enough focus on vulnerability and what's the sort of the systemic drivers of why people are vulnerable to climate change or biodiversity loss in the first place. And I think that conversation means that we end up talking very much about the drivers, about climate change or biodiversity loss, and not enough about sort of what are the systems that we actually need to change in order to make the kind of transitions that we would need, both to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also, of course, to help ensure that we actually have sustainable adaptation. And I think in response to the question about sort of what is the difference between loss and damage and adaptation, to me, the big elephant in the room, although my cat is sitting on my desk, I should probably say the big cat in the room, is this missing discussion about vulnerability. Because if we don't actually address why people are even losing things, why their damage is happening, it's as if we're saying that the only thing that really seems to matter is the changing climate or the changing ecosystems or whatever. But actually, our development processes are equally responsible for a lot of the reason that people are exposed and sensitive to climate hazards. So, I mean, I think this is partly one of the challenges that comes with that these three Rio conventions are focused on these essentially what are social processes, but they turn into these biophysical processes, and they're reduced into these biophysical processes. And perhaps if we were to, the sort of the synergies really are around human behavior and human development, right? That's what's led us to the problems in the first place. But I mean, just going back to thinking about this kind of from therefore this EBA or NBS perspective, I guess as a human, somebody who studies human systems, I'm always a little bit stumped by how you can discuss that vulnerability dimensions in the same way in the context of EBA or in the context of NBS, because then, of course, again, it becomes about people. And I know we say that these people and ecosystems are integrated, but I'm just, perhaps I'm just kind of putting that out there as maybe something for discussion. But in general, I think we avoid this conversation about vulnerability because it gets into very difficult issues that are in some ways driven by politics. And again, the way that we've presented a lot of these climate and biodiversity issues, somehow we've managed to disassociate the politics, even though we know these are all inherently driven by politics. But somehow it's become this sort of, these physical processes that therefore don't seem to have the actors, the agents, who has to act, who's going to be responsible for taking action. There's not sufficient focus on that. And I suppose that is why, even though a lot of people are very disappointed with the outcomes of COP27, that fact that for once there is really recognition of what people talk about in terms of climate justice, that I think that is a huge victory. Again, we need the money to be in that fund, but I think that is a victory.
All right, thank you very much, Lisa, for these insights and your reflections and sharing them with us. Maybe we have time for another reflection from you, Tristan, from you, Bertha, on this whole idea of synergies, integration, and how we move forward practically before we then, also go into questions from the audience. Who wants to go first? Tristan, shall we just give Tristan the word there, please, remotely in Montreal? Tristan, reflections on what you just heard and synergies, integration.
Thanks very much. Your suggestion about a joint COP or somehow bringing UNFCCC and CBD together, it has been suggested before. Given the madness that was COP27, trying to add in CBD delegates, it would need a fundamental rethink of what a COP actually is, and the trade show element that certainly happens in parallel. But in terms of those sort of synergies, absolutely, it needs to be better. But this is not a new discussion. This has happened. This has been happening pretty much since the early 90s, I would imagine. Certainly towards the start of my career, back in sort of early 2000s, we were looking at even just national reporting templates and having a common reporting template for parties that would work across the 3 Rio conventions and then also across the biodiversity related conventions. And it was a wonderful academic exercise that went absolutely nowhere. But more recently, we have been looking at how to get NBSAPs and NDCs, at least in terms of the development process and then hopefully the implementation of them in a more synergistic manner, that as countries, as governments, as parties go through those processes, that they are bringing the experts from both sides together, working on those documents together, at least, whether either physically or just in parallel timeframes if possible, and then looking at how to make sure that those plans, as well as various development plans, depending on sort of sectoral plans, etc., can somehow be linked or at least recognized, to try and bring that implementation together at some sort of level anyway, and not just waiting for cover decisions to happen to mention biodiversity protection, which is also troublesome wording for us, especially when you're talking about that, as Lisa mentioned, in terms of recognizing the vulnerability, those who fundamentally rely on, in this case, sort of biodiversity, ecosystem services, nature's benefits to people, however you want to phrase it, and recognizing that their rights and their needs are central to this. But actually, when it comes to implementing those decisions that are finally taken, that there is some sort of cohesion somewhere. I think just coming back to the question of finance, the reality is that money talks, and if there's money available, then people will sit up and listen and hopefully act. It was interesting what you said, Elke, about how 93% of the biodiversity related finance is climate related. I wonder what the percentage is going the other way. What percentage of the climate finance is biodiversity related? Within our resource mobilization team here, have been looking at that, and certainly the amount of biodiversity relevant financing within climate flows is not commensurate to the actual contribution that nature makes, and that is something that needs to be recognized and dealt with in a positive manner. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Tristan. And maybe Bertha, from your perspective, maybe picking up on finance or whatever topic you want to pick up with a short statement. Thank you.
I think I'll pick up on finance just because, and to try to bridge, as you mentioned at the beginning, the gap between the negotiators and the practitioners, because I think if you look at finance, the silos between finance, biodiversity, and other topics, and also between climate change and development, which is what I understand was also being mentioned, you know, how like the development models are also a driver of vulnerability and therefore a link to, you know, adaptation and the impact of climate change. So I think from the perspective of climate finance, it is important to understand that those silos are there, I would say, on purpose. And I want to go back to the idea of what the convention says about climate finance, just to explain to you, because I know for practitioners, this might be like, why is it on purpose to keep those silos? But if you think about climate finance in the context of the UNFCCC, climate finance is supposed to be new and additional. And this is a very important thing to understand when you're like dealing with negotiations, especially from the point of view of developing countries, because what that means is that it's new and additional from the finance that already existed for development, developmental projects, and other, you know, goals like biodiversity. Even though in practice and for scientists it doesn't make any sense, but for finance it does make sense because this finance is supposed to be new and additional. Then we don't want to mix it up with other things, because, you know, if you mix development and climate change, then you're probably taking money away from other development priorities like health and education to dedicate it to adaptation and mitigation. And this is why the silo is on purpose, I would say, when we talk about climate finance. And though I think there's a lot of thinking and a lot of trust, again, you know, finance is always the issue of trust, that needs to go into how to break those silos while at the same time keeping this notion that is very dear and to the heart of developing countries, that this is new and additional and is not rehatching the same finance for other uses. And so I just want to, like, you know, kind of put out there. Yeah. And it does speak to the problem of the loss and damage as well, because from the technical perspective, when you think about loss and damage, you have preventing, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. You know, that's how you think about it when you see the more technical work. And when you really think about what that means, when we talk about preventing, I don't know if that's the right word, but it's basically the right idea, that's mitigation. When you think about minimizing, that's adaptation. And when you think about addressing, that is what we call, well, all of those hard things that are beyond mitigation and adaptation, which we know by the IPCC that there are already things that are beyond adaptation. And so this is why the fund was created, to address loss and damage, to separate that finance from what already exists for mitigation and adaptation. So it's not a denial that loss and damage has a link to adaptation. It's just this very purposeful way of separating the finance that already exists for adaptation, which, as we mentioned, is very low, from what is to come next, which is finance to address the losses that are already going to happen because some ecosystems, some social systems are already beyond adaptation. And so this is just to explain a little bit, like the silos.
Thank you very much. It's very useful to understand within this discussion that we're having about how to bring things together. I'm looking at this big clock that's ticking here in front of me. It says 17 minutes. Isn't it amazing how fast the time is running? I would like to give the chance now also to the people in the room and those joining us virtually. Elke has something on her mind that she wants to say. Quickly.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just a few remarks on financing, because it's such an important issue. Of course, we have to look at the percentage of how much climate financing is also biodiversity relevant. Terence, you're completely right. And we were in the lucky position, and I can say that very proudly, that we had our chancellor announcing that we will raise our biodiversity financing per year up to 1.5 billion from 2025 on, which is 1/4 of climate financing. So this, I think it's a big step to go, but some steps are done. At the CBD COP, I'm not sure whether you know that or whether it's known. We were preparing a so-called 10-point plan on biodiversity financing beforehand. This is a really reasonable plan where international financing is only one of 10. So the new and additional discussion is, I think it has to be reframed in the situation that is possible, right? I do not want to say that you're not right, you're completely right, but there's a more complex view on that. And the last thing,
last one, yes.
Synergies. I think, or I put it that on the very end.
You put it at the end, that's
yes,
good.
Yes.
Okay, we keep it for
then.
that. 15 minutes left. All right. I would like to start looking at our virtual participants, and I see my colleague Uli sitting there, and I think he's observing the chat. I wonder whether there's some questions that came in so far. No questions so far from India, South Africa, and Germany, and all the other people who have joined. That's not a problem. We will keep looking at the chat. From the room, there was such, yeah, please, could you please, short question or contribution, please say your name and your institutional affiliation, if you may.
Thank you very much, Frederick Stapke from REA. As we look at the last few COPs, we've moved from focus on mitigation to focus on adaptation now to loss and damage. So while loss and damage obviously is a great step forward, it does sound a little bit like it's too late for some of the vulnerable countries. So Germany has taken great strides in supporting vulnerable countries. For instance, when the COVID pandemic hit, they put out the Corona response package, which has been really effective already. Now, as we look at defining what type of investments we will do through loss and damage fund, are there any lessons learned that we can already draw from the Corona response package that the BMUV has put out? And what is the role of EBA in the context of loss and damage? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are you addressing your question to one panelist in particular, or?
Maybe Frau Steinmetz.
Elke, please start. Yeah, and the others can respond as well.
It's a very good question. Thank you very much. I think we did not have the chance to look completely deep into the new fund idea, so I cannot respond it fully. But what we learned from the Corona response package is that you have to have both approaches. The immediate response that has to come very quickly, very fast track and very swift, but also the midterm sustainable approach that gives you a more, the chance to support in a more long-term or future-looking manner. This sounds very abstract, but what I want to say is that such a kind of fund, to my point of view, I'm not the responsible one in the ministry for that, but to my point of view, it would have to have both aspects. This is something I can say immediately, but as Berta said, I think there will be a lot of discussions about the fund, who's going to put money in it, how will it be distributed, to whom, with what criteria, and so on. So, but thank you for the idea that we can serve with our experience from the Corona response package.
Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add there, Berta, on that?
No, I think, any past experience, and I think that's also the point of the fund, right? To build on past experiences from climate change, but obviously also from other types of emergency responses, to design a fund that is adapted to the needs. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions here in the room? Yes, please. Here in the front, second row, the gentleman.
Jonas Rüger from Oro Verde.
Can you take off the mask for a second, if that's okay? Yeah, thank you.
With pleasure. Jonas Rüger from Oro Verde Tropical Forest Foundation. I mean, there has been a lot of talk about how the Ukraine war is affecting COP and negotiation processes. So I'd like to know from you if there are specific points in the agreement or specific parts of the process where you sense that this crisis has affected COP27.
Is that specifically for me or for
the panel?
For the whole panel. Who wants to pick it up?
Because I have a lot of trust in German Watch opinions so far.
Well, I can start if you want. I mean, I think there's a very specific points and then more general ones. So in the more general sense, I think there is in the text some reference to the broader socioeconomic context that is happening and how that is affecting the ability of countries to respond to climate change. There is issues of like the energy crisis that obviously the war has created, and you know the also a food security crisis and how that interacts with the ongoing climate crisis. So in that sense, there is that broader discussion that's not specific, right? But it does. Let's say it does have, it serves as a background to the discussions on mitigation, because obviously the energy crisis and the response to this energy crisis, which sometimes has been, well, let's go back to gas, even though it's just for a little bit, or, you know, let's step back to, you know, fossil fuels, even though just temporarily, also informs the discussions, even though maybe in the text you will not find it as such, but it's definitely part of the process of negotiations. And then there's other things like more specific, like for example, who has access to what and why certain funds that are multilateral are important, because for example, there were specific instances of, for example, Belarus complaining in one of the finance negotiations that have seen climate finance projects denied to them with no explanation, and the sense is obviously that there is an explanation, it's just not a climate explanation, it's more of a geopolitical explanation. So I would say, I mean, you wouldn't see it necessarily in the response, but it's definitely there in the background as part of the process of negotiation. That would be my take on it, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Bertha, any more questions? Uli, also if something's coming up in the chat, you let me know. Otherwise, from the room? Any more contributions to the discussion or questions? Not right now. Would you like to add something on the question raised earlier, Elke?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to. I have nothing to add. Just another aspect on the crisis in relation to the war. I think the situation that we are in now shows that we can rethink how we spend our money. We can do that. And I think this is also something good in this crisis, right? That the money or the financial flows can be rethought, so to say. And I think this is also a chance that we should take when thinking about general climate issues and biodiversity issues. Just to add that.
All right. Thank you, Elke. And I see no more hands. Please, there's one lady in the front, please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Tora Ahmed, Conservation and Development. My question, you mentioned it several times and Lisa touched on it, Tristan, transformation. So we need to look into new ways of doing things, of thinking in new ways, of acting out. I would like to hear from the panelists maybe a short statement on what could be the implications for development corporations. Many of us work in projects, support our partners or work from within or accompanying them. What is your take on that, the outcomes of COP and the discussions that we are living right now with regards to transformation and new ways of doing things? Thank you.
Thank you, Tora. And I would like to give this question to Lisa and Tristan, whoever is ready. Maybe Lisa, I saw you nodding. Perhaps you wanna react to that? Maybe it's close to the question of systemic drivers.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for the question. I mean, I guess I also may be touching on the question about Corona response because I think just as a starting point, what the COVID experience, and I'm not referring specifically to the German response, but in living in the UK during the pandemic, or the first year and a half of the pandemic, one thing that became very clear to me was that the sort of the systemic drivers of inequality, of marginalization, were also at the heart of sort of pointing out who was the most likely to be exposed to the pandemic or to the virus. And this has to do with sort of the people who are marginalized from getting the right kind of health care, and have been for reasons of, class, race, and other kinds of sort of drivers of marginalization. And so and the reason I wanted to say that is because I think this is also something that again, going back to the point about the missing conversation about vulnerability, I mean, one of the things that we see over and over again, and in the IPCC Working Group 2 report, we have a huge amount of evidence that adaptation projects, the way that they're working now, are not actually helping address the problem. They're not actually making people less vulnerable. In fact, many projects are making people more vulnerable, which we call maladaptation, which Edgar touched on in her opening. And so,
may I interrupt you there, Lisa? And if in this context, if we think about new ways of doing things, is there anything that you could share from the science perspective of how to do the things right?
Well, exactly. That was exactly what I was going to say now. So the point is that in order to avoid these problems, and we know exactly what drives these problems, in the IPCC report, we talk about climate resilient development pathways as kind of the way forward for thinking about this. And that integrates adaptation and mitigation to support sustainable development. It includes thinking about ecosystems. It includes sort of the whole package of things. But it is really also acknowledging that every single decision that we make about the way that we plan for development helps us move either towards or away from high climate resilient development future. So I think embedded in that is this necessity to rethink the systems that we have, and therefore transformation is the only way that we can achieve that. But very much, I guess the point is that in multiple levels, things are functioning within institutional structures that really need to be shaken up, and maybe even rethought or abandoned completely. So certainly we need some revolutionary changes. And this is partly why I think people are very threatened by that. And the concept of transformation doesn't sit very comfortably with many governments.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you also for this question that is already giving us a forward-looking perspective. I would like to do one thing with you now here towards the end, because we have a bit more than 3.5 minutes left in this panel. Tomorrow we have a plenary session, and we want to look at the way forward, where to go, where EBA, where NBS for adaptation has to go, and what are good ideas and what are first steps to go forward. And I would like to collect some of your ideas, very practical, very perhaps big ideas, but small steps, where you would put the priority for the way forward, looking at the results of the COP, looking at what's coming out of COP15, and would like to collect some of these ideas from you. So basically, messages also to the people here in the room, and also those joining us virtually. And yeah, I would say 1 minute per person. That would be the time frame for the statements. Who would like to start? That's always it.
I'll go, since I didn't have a chance to respond to the last question. So well, actually a couple of things. There's this question about, well, what does it mean to have nature-based solutions recognized in decision text, and whether it's and or ecosystem-based approaches. Just one minor point, we keep talking about EBA. In those decisions, it's ecosystem-based approaches, not ecosystem-based adaptation. So it's E-B-A rather than E-b-A. I think that's an important distinction to recognize. But the issue, and one of the reasons why certain groups, whether it's parties or certain civil society actors, are hesitant or reticent about the use of nature-based solutions, is because of potential inappropriate implementation and potential loss of access, rights, benefits in their context. And so it's a shame that we didn't have Michael Roth from Munich Re here with us to also talk about this. But there are concerns about, well, what is the role of the private sector and how would they use this term? What is the role of certain governments and how would they use, or not just the term, sorry, but the actual approach? The role of governments. How are the different stakeholders recognized and appropriately included within the implementation of whether it's nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches or even ecosystem-based adaptation, that their rights and voice are sufficiently recognized and heard. One thing that is within the draft text for the GBF is as an overarching principle is a human rights-based approach. It's in square brackets. It'll be interesting to see whether it makes it to the final text. But it's this idea that this should underpin all action and implementation of the framework once it's adopted. But in terms of just generally what needs to happen is just recognizing that there is a role for everyone. If we look at where we have effectively conserved biodiversity, the majority is on lands and territories governed by indigenous peoples and local communities. They need to be part of this solution, but also recognizing everyone, whether it's local urban communities, whether it's the private sector, where it's governments at all levels. What's the role for the international agencies like ourselves and others? And then, of course, there's a question of finance. I've gone well over a minute. Apologies for that. But it's just it's very much about implementation and making sure that any action is done with full participation and consultation. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, Tristan. Lisa, over to you with a quick message for the EBA community and the practitioners.
I think I got a lot of time already. I think maybe what I would just say is that I think there needs to be more opportunities to integrate across the different communities of discussion, because I do still think that there seems to be some questions from us as working more on the social dimensions. How do we actually engage in these discussions? And to be honest, nature-based solutions concept scares me a lot because of the word solutions. But I mean, even so maybe that's the final point, is that it would be great to see more collaboration and discussion across the different types of adaptation work.
All right, Lisa, thank you so much. Berta, what would you like to leave as a final message on the panel?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what's been said, and I just want to add, because I was looking at this very interesting project in the early morning discussion, yeah. Yes, and I think the notion of climate justice, I think that's very important, and I think that's what's being said. We in our context, we also call it locally led adaptation. And it's this idea that it is the communities, the indigenous peoples, the people that are actually on the ground feeling the impacts, that need to be leading the process, not a top-down. And I know this is repeated very often, but a very bottom-up approach in which there's actual devolution of decision-making to the local level to find their own solutions and institutionalize those solutions within their livelihoods and their lifestyles. And I think that's quite important. So I just want to, agree with what has been said before.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Elke.
Very little to add or to say. I just thought that when looking at synergies, that was the thing before. From my experience, I think you often come to a point when it's not worth engaging more and putting more energy in searching for synergies. I think as we were talking about merging or not merging the conventions, please not. I think you can spend too much time and energy on that. I think coherence is fine, right? And it will create synergies, to my experience at least. So this is one takeaway that I would like to give to you. Look for coherence and synergies will come. And the second thing is I'm very convinced about partnerships, about networking, about common learning from each other. So this is also the reason why I think this particular project and the networking opportunity that we have here is so important. I mentioned this NBS initiative that was launched in Sharm el-Sheikh, the INACT initiative. I think it would be great if any kind of partnerships or networks could come to this initiative to support it and to make it even more.
For example, the EBA.
Exactly. That's what I think could bring a lot of added value. And last thing on the COP, CBD COP, we will be very happy to launch a partnership there together with Colombia and other partners on NBSAPs. So on a partnership on immediately implementing the GBF through the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. I think this is also something where, of course, nature-based solutions will play a key role. And these were the 3 small things that I wanted to add. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Elke. And with this, we're at the end of the panel, and I would like to thank you all, Lisa and Tristan and Bertha and Elke here. You've been a great panel. Thanks so much. A big applause, please, for everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time, for being with us remotely, taking time off from your busy schedules, Tristan and Lisa. You're welcome to join the live stream, welcome to join our following sessions. We will be going into a break now for it's a bit less than half an hour. We start again at 4 o'clock p.m. German time. Information will be in the live stream as well, and we will start with an introduction to the breakout sessions, but start first in plenary here. Thanks so much again also to you listening in and joining the conversation. See you in a little bit.